Well, we have just heard today confirmation from the government that the Prime Minister of this country has failed in his duty to raise the serious incident in which Australian personnel were injured in his meeting with the Chinese President. Senator Farrell was asked that question directly by the opposition in question time today. Did the Prime Minister raise it? And Senator Farrell said that Australia's objections started with the Deputy Prime Minister, not with the Prime Minister, who had a face-to-face meeting where he could have raised it, but with the Deputy Prime Minister, and only once the Prime Minister had left and had evaded questions. Leadership at the top of this government is completely absent, and we have seen that time and time again in recent months. And that is further demonstrated by the fact that I understand in the other place during question time today, the Prime Minister was directly asked this question and he still wouldn't answer it, and he started talking about trade with China. That is just so sadly typical of this government. A serious naval incident in which Australian personnel were injured by the Chinese Navy, and the Prime Minister's response is to try and boast about trade and other matters. His response was, quite frankly, disgraceful. This is a serious matter which deserves a straight answer in this parliament. Let us not forget that just 2 years ago, Australia was regarded as leading the world in standing up to China's coercion. Our allies were happy to say that publicly and often that this was the case. And at the time, the Labor Party was prepared to stand with the government and make clear that Australia was in the right in terms of the actions that we had taken, and that it was the CCP's coercive actions that were unacceptable. But fast forward 2 years, and now all we are hearing from this Albanese government are the lines about how it was all the previous Australian government's fault, it was all the Morrison government's fault. Let's be very clear. This was the line that the Chinese government has been pushing for years. This was the reason why they implemented the unlawful trade sanctions, to try and get the Australian public to blame our country for standing up for our own interests. And for a long time, it didn't work. But then the Prime Minister began to see a political advantage in blaming Australia for what the Chinese government had done to cut off contact and implement trade embargoes. And he began to do everything he could not to stand up for Australia and our interests, but to be granted a visit to China where he could boast, as he frequently does, about stabilised relations. For many months now, the Albanese government has joined the Chinese government in publicly blaming the former Australian government for China implementing trade sanctions and refusing to take phone calls or meetings. Absolute shame.